Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited, John Haynes, A Conversation with Death. The man who rules the world and the angel of darkness take on a horde of demons in this inaugural John Haynes series adventure. Get John Haynes, A Conversation with Death for 99 cents on Kindle or in paperback today. Over the last week, I've had several of these Afro-American Negroes coming to my comments section talking about how I am some sort of David Carroll clone or some David Carroll wannabe. Now, I respect the work of YouTuber David Carroll. However, my observations regarding the dysfunction of this Afro-American Negro and the Negro community come from my own personal experience and my own personal observations. And those personal observations started back in 1985 when I attended IS 148 here in the Bronx. And in IS 148, I got a first-hand look at the dysfunction of the Afro-American Negro inside many of the classes I attended with many of these Afro-American Negroes who come from these single mother households. Now, this IS 148 here in the Bronx is one of the worst junior high schools in New York City. And back in the 1980s, it was a complete cesspool. And if you went to that school, you would understand how dysfunctional these Afro-American Negroes are, because you would see their behaviors firsthand and you would get an understanding of this dysfunction. And as I went to classes in IS 148 here in the Bronx, I began to see the dysfunctional behaviors going on around me. And even at the young age of 12 years old, I started to say to myself, there is something wrong with many of these Afro-American Negroes. And I started to say that because their behaviors showed it. I mean, when you see teenage boys asking another man if he's in a relationship with a girl, there's something wrong with that male, and there's something possibly sexually suspect as related to that Negro's behavior, because that's not the normal developmental behavior of a pre-adolescent boy. And when I take a look at my experience at IS 148 and Park West later on in my high school career, again, I think of myself sort of like Diane Fossey. Now, Diane Fossey was this white woman who went into Africa to live among the gorillas. And back in 1988, they made a movie starring Sigourney Weaver called Gorillas in the Midst. And it was all about how Diane Fossey went to live amongst the gorillas to learn about their behaviors, learn about their lifestyle, learn about their culture. And I saw myself in some ways like Diane Fossey in living among the Afro-American Negro, like being in the midst of the gorillas. So I come from the perspective of the gorillas in the midst, and because I come from that perspective of the gorillas in the midst, I can approach the subject regarding the dysfunction of the Afro-American Negro from the perspective of an insider, because I'm the guy who lived amongst the Afro-American Negro. I've seen his dysfunction with my own eyes. I've watched his behavior with my own eyes. I've studied his behavior, and because I have studied and watched his behavior right in the environment, that gives me an area of expertise that others do not have. And when you take a critical look at this dysfunction, you can literally say to yourself that everything that David Carroll talks about in his videos is correct, because I've seen this firsthand in my own experience in the black community, where I can see these Negroes out here being dysfunctional, these Negroes being violent, and I can see the root of that behavior because, again, it comes from that single mother household, and it comes from those white liberal welfare policies. Now, those white liberal welfare policies, they are the thing that created the welfare state, and the welfare state is what created the dysfunction in the black community, because many of these males who grow up in these single mother households, they grow up with a feminized state of thinking and a female approach to life. And it's that female approach to life that leads to their dysfunction because these males have no father figure in the home, they have no male figures in the home, and because they have no male figures in the home, they do not know how to behave as men, and they have no model for manhood as men. I myself had some models for manhood in an older brother and a father, so I know how a man is supposed to behave. And that's why I could sit down and say to myself that this Negro's behavior is completely dysfunctional at 12 years old, is because I had male figures in my life to model manhood for me. I saw my brother getting up every day as he went to go to work. I saw a father who came by once a week, and he also modeled the behavior of having a work ethic and work. And he taught me lessons about being responsible. And these were all, again, skills that I learned from other men. Many of these beta male Negroes, on the other hand, they did not get these lessons taught to them by men. They did not get taught social skills by men. They never learned how to interact with men. They don't know the unwritten social rules about men. And when it comes down to these beta males, when they see another man, they want to try to threaten that man because they feel insecure about themselves, they feel insecure about their own masculinity, and they feel insecure about their own male identity because they know that there's something wrong with their male identity because they know that their masculine identity was shaped and defined by a female, and that's what makes them uncomfortable. Now, when it comes down to my further knowledge of this Afro-American Negro, it not only comes from my personal experience growing up here in the South Bronx among the Afro-American Negro and going to places like IS 148 and Park West High School, it also comes from my knowledge from reading numerous books about the black community and the black experience, like your Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, your Claude Brown's Man-Child in the Promised Land, and many other books about black culture and the black experience. And it also comes from me watching shows like your Tony Brown's Journal and reading books like Tony Brown's Black Lies and White Lies and reading numerous articles in numerous publications because I have done extensive research on black people over the years as I've gone out here to write over 60 books regarding not only African American fantasy, but also trying to write stories that are positive about the African American experience because I know that black culture is greater than what many of these Negroes know because many of these Negroes, they only come from the place and perspective of their single mother. And their single mother, her perspective is very narrow because she's very emotional. And what she sees the world as is primarily the neighborhood and the streets, and that's where the Negro likes to stay because he only wants to stay in the environment of his mother. I myself have come out of the neighborhood and the streets due to my relationship with my older brother who showed me a larger world as I grew up, and because of that I could see things from a panoramic perspective. And because I can see things from the panoramic perspective, I can see the dysfunction of this Afro-American Negro clearly, and I can see where he gets that perspective from because he's coming from the perspective of that single mother, and her whole life is primarily the neighborhood and primarily the block. And the reason why her perspective is the neighborhood and the block is because many women are primarily emotional and many women are short-term thinkers. And that's why all she can think about are designer handbags, designer shoes, and still are wind up living in the projects eating dollar cups of ramen because her whole perspective of the world is a very narrow one, it's a very limited one, and she doesn't know about thinking from the panoramic perspective because that's something fathers do because fathers primarily are logical and they're thinking about building in the long term. And many black men can't build in the black community due to the dysfunctional nature of this Afro-American Negro female who is insecure and does not trust a black man to help build with him. No, she only trusts this white man and his welfare state because she's primarily dependent on that welfare state to get her needs met. And because she's primarily caught up in the welfare state and the government system of white men, that's why we don't have a black community, because she's not interested in building an economy. As long as she is a consumer, as long as she is getting her needs met by her white liberal slave masters and the welfare state, she is completely gratified because the government goes out here and they give her these government programs like welfare, WIC, Section 8, and all these programs, and they give her these government jobs and these other jobs out here, and they use her as a consumer to get money out of the black community. And that's how we changed from a patriarchy to a matriarchy, and that's how 97% of black dollars wind up leaving the black community every year, and $1.1 trillion in cash spending power and $2.2 trillion in credit spending power keeps the black community poor, because your black female, primarily, all she wants to do is meet her short-term needs and never thinks about the long-term needs. And because she does not think about the long-term needs, this is why your community is a cesspool, and this is why you don't have any control over your whole economy, because it was black men who go out here and build businesses, and it's black men who go out here and build and maintain an economy. And thanks to her leadership, this is why Hispanics controlled most of the bodegas in the neighborhood that I grew up in, because originally there were black-owned grocery stores in my very own Bronx neighborhood. However, as many of the black men got older and retired, their sons were not prepared to take on the role of manhood, so others came in and took over that part of the community. And as those Hispanics came to power, they wound up controlling the economy here in the South Bronx. And I saw this happen firsthand with my own eyes. I saw Hispanics coming in, I saw Koreans come in, and over time I began to see the Arabs come in. But overall, the economic power in the Bronx has been solidified by Hispanics, because Hispanic homes, in many cases, they had fathers in them, and those men taught their sons how to build businesses, and those men used their economic power to get political power, and now they have complete control of the South Bronx. And I saw this over the 44 going on 45 years here that I lived here in the South Bronx. So when I come, again, from my perspectives, I come from the perspective of my personal experience. I come from the books I have read on the black community and the black experience, and I also come from other places in research where I've done and where I've studied different civilizations, and I've studied black history extensively. Now, again, when it comes down to this Negro, they want to sit down and say, I'm a David Carroll clone, but again, I come from my own perspective and my own experience. And that can be seen as far back as 1999, when I wrote the first ISIS story. And in the first ISIS story, I talk about the whole concept of the deification of white men. And in one chapter in ISIS, I go into this extensively. In chapter 15 of ISIS, I literally talk about the deification of white men, and I can read you an excerpt from ISIS to show you where I get my observations regarding this Negro. Now, in this chapter 15, I have a passage where ISIS talks about how these white men are gods, and I'm going to read it to you. Now, in this page 116, in the first ISIS, the original edition, it says, living in a free state didn't necessarily mean I had rights either. On my first payday on a job as a cook, my white employer cheated me out of most of my wages by charging me for trumped up expenses I never made. When I disagreed with him over my wages, I was ridiculed by my coworkers for standing up for my rights. I hated the fact that I couldn't do anything about it. In any other country, cheating a person out of their pay would be unjust, but in America, a Negro person was discouraged from disagreeing with anyone white, even if they were right. It was as if these white people were gods and their opinions were law. It frustrated me that I had to accept being slighted on a regular basis. Sometimes it was a scowl in my direction, other times it was being told that I couldn't do things that I did freely in the rest of the world. A washerwoman told me that if a white man said crap was chocolate, I was to smile, take a bite out of it, and tell him it tasted good. Over time, I learned to acquire a taste for crap. So, I wrote this back in 1999. So, how can I be a David Carroll clone if I wrote this back in 1999 talking about the deification of white men in a story about a Nubian goddess who comes to America and observes the dysfunctional behavior of the Afro American Negro? You can go pick up Isis and see what I'm talking about in chapter 15, because chapter 15 comes from my observations of the Afro American Negro, the black community, and many of my books also talk about the dysfunction of the Afro American Negro. In fact, the entire novel Spellbound, featuring Matilda Crowley, the African American goth character, is also about the dysfunctional thinking of the Afro American Negro, and in specifics, the Afro American Negro female's dysfunction. So I've been writing about the dysfunctional behavior of the Afro American Negro for over 25 years. And that, again, comes from my own personal experiences, it comes from my years of research, and it comes from my numerous books that I have read over the years. In another video I did a few years ago where somebody made the accusation of me being a David Carroll clone, I literally picked up all the books where I get my information regarding the dysfunction of this Afro-American Negro female, and I showed everyone all the books where I displayed all the dysfunction, because I read all of that black fiction talking about the single, successful, well-educated black woman who said that she can't get a man. And I read those books and I started to see the dysfunctional patterns in their own literature. So when I go out here and I can talk about this Negro female and I can talk about this Negro's dysfunction, again, I can come from a place that lets me understand this Negro backwards and forwards. I know this Negro like the back of my hand, and I can talk about his dysfunction because, again, I know his dysfunction. I know where it comes from. I know why he does this. And again, if I could see this at 12 years old and see there's something wrong with this Negro, then someone like David Carroll could also see the dysfunction with this Negro. And again, that dysfunction does not come from some evil white man as the foundation. It comes from many of these Negroes themselves and this Negro female who taught them this dysfunctional culture by teaching them that they had to learn how to be completely dependent on her. Because when it comes down to these Negroes who come from these female-headed households, the main reason why they are dysfunctional is that female. She is the teacher of culture who taught them this dependent mindset. And this is why these males, they feel that they have to go, they feel instead of think. They're primarily emotional creatures, and as emotional creatures, they go out here and act on impulse, they act on their feelings. I saw this firsthand at IS 148, I saw it at Park West, and I even saw it at the Strive Job Readiness Workshop back in 2000, where I was working as part of the AmeriCorps Vista program. And as I worked at the AmeriCorps Vista program with many of the single mothers, many of the homeless, many of the ex-offenders, many of the drug addicts, I began to learn about why many of these Afro-American Negroes just couldn't hold jobs, many of these Negroes couldn't keep jobs, and the reasons for that dysfunction was primarily, again, those single mother households and that female mindset that many of these Negroes had, because many of these Negroes, again, they are so caught up in their feelings, so caught up in their emotions, and so caught up in the short term that they can't think about doing things in the long term, like keeping jobs. And the reason why they can't keep a job is, again, as I wrote in an article for the Negro Manosphere, they have a single mother mindset and a single mother work ethic. And the single mother mindset and the single mother work ethic, it comes from the single mother because she's used to getting her needs met by others, and because she's used to getting her needs met by others, she doesn't have to think about doing things for herself. The government gives her things, and men give her things, and this is why her boys can't go out here and do things on their own like a man, because men who grow up with fathers and brothers, what they know how to do is they know how they have to go out here and do for themselves, and they know they have to put themselves first, and they know they have to focus on meeting their own needs and not focus on meeting the needs of others. Now, while I've had my fair share of issues with my long-term unemployment, I have still tried to persevere and tried to build on my own, because that's what I know a man has to do. A man has to go out here and try to make efforts to make his own living. But many of these other Negroes out here, they don't know how to do this, and this is why I make these videos, to try to help wake up this Negro. But some of these Negroes out here, they are extremely jealous of a man who is trying to help them, and their jealousy is what prevents them from seeing that someone is trying to help them. And I've tried to help black people for over 20 some odd years. At 17 years old, I dedicated myself to writing positive African American fiction and trying to diversify the black book market, because I could see the calm before the storm when back in the 1990s when that minstrel group NWA came to popularity. I could see the dysfunction of the Negro starting to escalate with the NWA. And I said to myself, I know that Bill Cosby isn't going to be around for much longer later on, and we need somebody to continue, building on the legacies of people like your Bill Cosbys, your Robert Townsends, and Spike Lees, and many others who tried to make an effort to try to present the Negro with a picture of himself so he could see who he really was. And people like Bill Cosby, they tried to do this. People like Dwayne McDuffie tried to do this. People like Spike Lee, they tried, and Robert Townsend tried to show that we were people. Unfortunately, due to the self-hatred many Negroes have, they went and bought into the Madison Avenue and Hollywood NWA, the so-called thug life, and they wound up heading down the dysfunctional road that we have many of these beta male Negroes on. And as we have entered the 21st century, and we now have this Negro online, his behavior is being broadcast to the world. And because these beta male Negroes and some of these Afro-American Negro females out here do not have the proper life skills that only a father can teach, what happens with many of these Negroes is they go out here and they don't understand concepts like boundaries, nor do they know how to navigate through their emotions. And because they don't understand boundaries, you will get these Negroes like the two that have been coming to my comment section. And what they do is they come to your comment section making accusations that you're a David Carroll knockoff, or that there's something wrong with you. And when you block these people from a channel, what they do is create more accounts. And when they create more accounts, they show us how completely dysfunctional they are. Because back in the days when I first came to the internet, when I was working at Strive and AmeriCorps Vista, and I first got my experience on the internet, I ran into many people online. And many of these people, they were very intelligent people. And what they would do when they disagreed with someone, or they saw some content online that they disagreed with, what they would do is click out of the content and move on, because they understood that during the 56K modem days of the internet, time was precious and money was precious, and they didn't want to waste either sitting there going to a page or a message board that they disagreed with or they didn't like. And they understood that, yes, I'm looking for information, and the information I'm looking for is not here, so I'm going to leave. And back in those days, We had a lot of goths online. We had a lot of different people online. And they too also noticed the change in the internet over the last couple of years. And they would sit there and say to themselves, look, back in the days of 98, 99, 2000, 2001, people would come here, they would be very civil. They would, if they disagreed with something, they knew how to present an argument regarding what they disagreed with. And if they disagreed and they agreed to disagree, and if they didn't like the content on a page, they just clicked out, hit the red X on the right hand side of the Windows or the left hand side of the Macintosh, and they kept it moving because they understood that their time was too precious to waste bickering and arguing with someone who was thousands of miles away and you weren't going to change their opinion. But over the last 17, 18 years, we've had more of these dysfunctional Negroes coming to the internet with the invention of high-speed internet and these smartphones, and all we've seen is the ignorance of the Negro presented online for the whole world to see. And what's really sad about seeing this is that the internet could be one of the greatest tools to elevate the black community, but black folks, they go out of their way to present their ignorance to the world online in many of these YouTube videos and in many things like these YouTube beefs, these message boards, or even these Facebook groups where many of these Afro-American Negroes cannot even come to a civil discourse. I remember going just a couple of days ago to a Facebook group. They were talking about the murder of this young Hispanic boy here in the Bronx, and I made an observation about how these single mothers were the core foundation of this dysfunction, and how these boys trying to kill, who murdered this boy over one of these females, was all due to the way that these single mothers raised these boys. And one of these Afro-American Negro females, biracial Negro females, she could not stand the logical argument I was presenting regarding these savages, and she just kept going on into shaming language, trying to get into a back and forth. And again, I looked at her behavior, and it was so dysfunctional. She was talking about my unemployment, talking about Jesse Williams and videos I've done on Jesse Williams, but she could not reinforce her arguments with facts. And again, that comes from that dysfunctional perspective of these females and these single mothers and the way that they have raised many of these Afro-American Negroes. And they turn every part of the black community into a cesspool, and they turn the virtual black world into a cesspool with their behavior. And that's why ever since I was like 16, I started putting distance between myself and many Negroes in the community, because many of these type of people with their emotional behavior and their dysfunctional behavior, they can destroy your life. They can get you in a situation like many young black men did back in the 90s and in the 80s, where you're just riding in a car with them and they've got drugs stashed in the car, and you're doing 20 years in prison because this guy is deciding he wants to move some weight, and because he knows how the court system works, he's going to get a plea deal and you're going to do 20 years. And that's why I put distance between myself and many Negroes, because you don't know what they're into, nor do you know what they're going to do at any given time, because many Negroes out here are extremely impulsive. So again, many of you Negroes will sit there and say, oh, he's a David Carroll knockoff. No, again, I come from my own personal experience dealing with you Negroes ever since you were 12 years old, ever since I was 12 years old. Ever since I was 12 years old, I came to observe your dysfunctional behavior. I observed your dysfunctional behavior in IS 148. I observed your dysfunctional behavior in Park West. I observed your behavior on the streets of the South Bronx. And I observed your dysfunctional behavior, and I began to get an understanding of your dysfunctional behavior working at the Strive Job Readiness Workshop, watching the most impossible and hardest of hard cases, not being able to find work. And I also saw it when I saw many of those black professionals not being able to understand how to work together towards meeting long-term goals, and watching that nonprofit program crumble into dust because people were caught up in their feelings and not thinking about the long-term aspects of maintaining the program. And I also saw the deification of white men there when they hired a white man to be their director of social services at the time, and they hired a white woman to take over their fundraising department. And I saw how people who were black and Latino, educated black professionals and Latino professionals, start submitting and deferring to people who were under them. So I understand the deification and worship of white men and white people because I saw that at Strive. I even saw it in my own family. I see it on the street. And again, in order for me to write about something, I have to know about it. And I know about the dysfunction of this Afro-American Negro. And I know about it so well, I can write about it in a book like Isis, which is African American fantasy. I can write about it in a book like Spellbound, which is a novel about a black girl in the goth subculture. I can write about it in a novel like The Thetas, which was about an African American sorority. And I can write about it in many of my nonfiction books, like Stop Simping, Why Men Don't Need Finance to Get Romance, or a blog like Ways Single Mothers Destroy Their Sons, Why Real Men Avoid Single Mothers, or that article I wrote for the Negro Manosphere talking about how black boys get a single mother work ethic. I can write about those subjects because I have that life experience. I have information that I have learned over the years. And I can take that information and I can turn it into a book like the upcoming Man Crisis because I have lived among you. I understand you. And because I understand you Negroes, I understand why you behave the way you do and why you participate in these behaviors, because many of you Negroes, you participate in these behaviors because you never had a father in your life to teach you how to behave. You never, a father in your life to teach you how to navigate the world. And he never taught you how to conduct yourselves in social situations. And this is why you participate in these antisocial behaviors online, going out here, making accusations that are unfounded and unsubstantiated, and you go out here after even being blocked and having your comments deleted, still continuing to make ad hominem attacks against a person and continuing to create more accounts to go back to that person's channel after being blocked, which shows us again how mentally disturbed many of you Negroes are, because the definition of insanity is doing the exact same thing and expecting a different result. And many Negroes out here are completely insane. And when I look at the guys who did that, making those accusations this time, they were clearly insane. I mean, I look at a dude who has an avatar of a man's bare chest. And that's quite troubling because it shows me he has latent homosexual tendencies. Then you have another Negro who's talking about he's David Carroll Jr. And again, that shows some latent homosexual tendencies right there for a Negro to put up that kind of picture. I mean, when I have my channel up, I have my own picture. And when you look at some of these Negroes and their behavior, you can clearly see the beta male behavior in the way they participate in, like putting up another man's picture as your avatar, or the latent homosexual behavior that they participate in by having a picture of a man's bare torso up there. All these behaviors show us the dysfunction of this Afro-American Negro on display, and they show us where this Negro is coming from, and that perspective is that of his single mother, because these are the same types of dysfunctional behaviors she participated in when she was out here having relationships with men, and those same dysfunctional behaviors are the reason why she's alone right now, and why many of her sons are in prison right now, or they're sitting in their mother's house right now, because these men never got the life skills they needed to go out here and survive and be men. And because they don't have the life skills that they need to survive to be men, this is why they continue to participate in all of this dysfunctional, juvenile, and childish behavior. If you'd like to try some of my SJS Direct publications I mentioned in this video, like ISIS, Spellbound, or the Thetas, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com and in the description box. There you can find those books and the books of the Simp series. And if you want to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.